So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats so we can start. Okay. So actually it should be good afternoon. His Excellency Ambassador of Japan, Sato Hideo, representatives of the Japanese Embassy, distinguished guests, thank you very much for coming this afternoon to celebrate with us the 60th anniversary of a diplomatic relationship between Japan and Israel. We are looking forward for 3 exciting days of talks that will examine various aspects of diplomatic, political, social, intellectual, and cultural exchange between our 2 countries. I'm very grateful to my colleague, Dr. Nisimot Mazgin, for putting together this event. And I would like also to extend thanks to our students, volunteers who worked very hard to make sure all of our guests from abroad arrived safely to their hotels. And yes, thank you very much for our volunteers. But first, let us start with the greetings from the Dean of the Humanities, Professor Reuven Amitai.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon or good evening in a little bit. His Excellency the Ambassador of Japan, colleagues from the Embassy of Japan, Professor Garon, and colleagues and guests here from the Hebrew University and from outside the university, I am very pleased and very honored to join you this evening to part of the opening of this wonderful conference. I missed the earlier opening of the exhibition, but the good tidings and the very positive reactions have already reached me. Indeed, you have 2 days of activities, mostly in front of you. Very rich program. I'm quite amazed actually by how rich and how many people are coming and how many lectures there are and how varied about how many different topics, and it's really quite a tour de force. And I really want to compliment and congratulate everybody involved, and of course Dr. Nisim Otmagin, who stood at the forefront, but not only with student volunteers, other colleagues, and the various bodies at the Hebrew University and outside the Hebrew University. I'll just mention in the university, the Truman Institute and the East Asian Studies Department, or as it's called now, Asian Studies Department, and the Freeburg Center for Asian Studies. So these are all, plus our colleagues and allies from outside the university. So the event is, of course, that we're commemorating is 60 years of diplomatic cooperation and relations between Israel and Japan. And this is very far from my own area of expertise. And I have to say that I don't have a lot to say about that particular topic. I visited in Japan and I know about the connections, but as a scholar, I have very little to say. So I began to think, what could I say that would be interesting or relevant or, let's say, not overly boring or anything. So I thought, first of all, that both of us are on Japan on one hand, all the way in the east, and Israel all the way in the west, on the 2 sides of Asia. And that got me thinking about something that I do know a little bit about, and that's the history of the Mongol World Empire. And I thought that in the 13th century, when the Mongols were moving across Asia in different directions, it's interesting to note that 2 places they did not conquer, they invaded but did not conquer. One is the land of Israel, and the other one is, of course, Japan. Obviously, the circumstances were different. Obviously, the circumstances are different in each case. In the case of the Japanese themselves, or they themselves resisted. In the case of the land of Israel or Palestine or whatever you want to call this little corner of Southwest Asia, it was not the locals, but rather the professional soldiers who came from Egypt who threw the Mongols out. But interestingly enough, this is about as far as they got in both directions. So that's certainly the basis of a strong bilateral relationship, if I could ever consider one. The other thing that I thought of interest, and again, I don't know much about diplomatic relations in the modern period. I know something about them in the 13th and 14th century, but I'm not going to talk about that. But I do know something I've learned in the last couple of years as dean, something about academic relations. And besides the coming and going of scholars in both directions across Asia, Israelis going to Japan, students and scholars going to Japan, and vice versa on myriad topics, not just Japanese studies and not just Jewish studies, but myriad topics. I thought that something that combines us and unites us, both sides, is a tremendous amount of curiosity. One thing that struck me in what I know about Japanese universities is that there seems to be an expert about everything. At least in the fields that interest us in the humanities and the social science, whether it's the various cultures and various languages and history all around the world. I don't think there's an area in the world that is not covered by somebody in a Japanese university, maybe more than one person, and they do it, of course, very, very well. And I think maybe not quite as completely, but we strive, at least here in Israel and also at the Hebrew University, to cast a wide net and to deal with different cultures, whether they're in Asia, of course. And now we deal with just not quite every culture in Asia, but we're gradually expanding. We deal with, of course, in our region from the beginning of civilization, even the presence of humans until today. Europe and its expansion in various areas, South America, North America, and elsewhere. Africa to a certain degree, maybe not as much as we would like, but at least we're trying. Today I was just I opened another conference on the Incas in South America, and one could say what is between the Incas and the state of Israel and the Israeli universities, but it's clear that that does interest some people, and they do a very, very good job at investigating it. So I think that the two commonalities are basis of a great relationship. On the one hand, resistance to the Mongols, and on the other hand, curiosity, basic, good, old-fashioned human, scientific, and intellectual curiosity are the basis of very, very good relations between the two countries. And that's the way I have no doubt that in 60 years from now, our intellectual and scholarly descendants will be sitting here talking about 120 years of diplomatic and academic relations between Israel and Japan. I want to thank Professor Garon for joining us, and I would like to say I am looking very much forward to his lecture, but at 4:30 I'm going to teach. So I have to run out. I will see you tomorrow. I am chairing a roundtable tomorrow, so I will join you again. And I have no doubt that given this high caliber list of lecturers and speakers and chairs and whatever, that this is going to be a great conference. And I'm sure that everybody's going to have an interesting and very, very exciting 2 days. So thank you and have a pleasant time.
Thank you, Professor Amitai. And now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. Professor Sheldon Garon is the Nissan Professor of History and East Asian Studies at Princeton University. He is a specialist in modern Japanese history and also writes about transnational history, which is namely a history that spotlights the flow of ideas and institutions among the United States, Japan, and European and Asian countries. His new book, and luckily I have it with me, it's called Beyond Our Means, Why America Spends While the World Saves. And with your permission, I will pass it around because it also has wonderful images. So his new book was published recently in Princeton University Press. It examines what Americans might learn from East Asian and European nations whose public policies have vigorously encouraged citizens to save. The book has attracted media attention from the New York Times, the National Public Radio, BBC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the New Yorker, Foreign Policy, Financial Times, Deutschland, the Asahi Shinbun, and I think even this morning Professor Garon was interviewed by The Marker, the economic supplement of Haaretz. His other publications include The State and Labor in Modern Japan from 1987, Molding Japanese Minds, The State in Everyday Life from 1997, and the co-edited volume, The Ambivalent Consumer, Questioning Consumption in East Asia and the West from 2006. His current project, which I think will be of interest for many of us, deals with a transnational history of home fronts in Japan, Germany, Britain, and the United States. The title of Professor Garon's talk today is Transnational Japan. So without further ado, please, Professor Garon.
Thank you very much, Shalmit, and thank you, Ambassador Sato, for coming today. And the dean is already he's already left, okay, but I wanted to thank him too if you were here. Well, of all the people in the room here, I'm probably the least knowledgeable about Japan-Israeli relations, although I have been here since Friday. And when I go back on Wednesday, I'm looking forward to being interviewed by CNN with, the caption under, Japan-Israel expert. So lucky for you, I'm not going to talk about Japan-Israel relations, but I would like to talk to you about some new trends, new developments in the study of Japan. And as Shalmit just suggested, what I'm talking about today is what's called transnational history or transnational studies. It is one of the hottest fields in history today, at least in North America. Transnational history, as Shalmit just explained to you, it's not the same as the older field of comparative history. I mean, it shares something. I compare lots of cases. But what's different about transnational history is that it goes beyond comparative history and actually looks at the linkages between the various national cases and historical developments. And I should say that transnational history, it's been very popular in North America, and I think to some extent in Europe. It's very promising, but it has some limitations. One of the limitations is, so far, a lot of so-called transnational history has been done by Americans about American history. So it's an attempt to globalize America and to write a transnational history of America. That's all very nice, but one of the problems that many Americans have, particularly historians of America, and I think in Israel I'm probably safe, I can't insult too many people in the room, most American historians of America, well, incredibly enough, do not speak foreign languages. So if you're going to do transnational histories of encounters and relations between Americans and, X country or Y country, it actually helps to know something about X and Y country to even be able to read their archives in their languages. So they can't do that. That's one problem of transnational history. But, not a problem we have to worry about too much here in Israel. But another problem that we do have to worry about as scholars of Japan is that thus far, most of transnational history, recent transnational history, has centered very much on the world of the North Atlantic. So it's either relations among European countries or it's relations between the United States. Once in a while, if we're in a good mood, we throw in Canada, and the North Atlantic world. And to some extent, the Europeans have actually done a better job. They tend to do transnational history of European countries and their colonial empires. But what's left out of this, and it's kind of a glaring gap, is East Asia. It plays almost no role in most of the transnational history that's been written. And this is very unfortunate. Not only, it excludes East Asia, but for us, it excludes Japan. And the exclusion of Japan is particularly glaring in the study of transnational history to this date. And why is it unfortunate? Well, if you think about, if you're trying to study transnational history in the modern world and you don't take account of Japan, that's a problem, because from the late 19th century, from Japan's Meiji era, Japan was really one of the most dynamic nation states, and of course very soon became a great power. But even more than that, the Japanese really emerged as, you could say, the transnational learners par excellence. That Japanese of all stripes, officials, entrepreneurs, social reformers, other middle-class people, spent a lot of time from the Meiji period, really all the way to the present, avidly investigating conditions in other countries, initially mainly the Western countries, and to some extent their colonial empires. And so the Japanese are great transnational learners. And moreover, those of us who study Japan and can read Japanese, it's a real asset to us because just to look at the records that Japanese have left us, you know, whether they're officials, entrepreneurs, reformers, their records of their study of the rest of the world actually helps us understand the rest of the world. It's very detailed, quite accurate reporting, and quite systematic. And so sometimes I like to try and embarrass European historians by telling them things I learned in Japanese sources about European history. And sometimes things they don't know because they were 100 years ago and don't seem particularly important today, were important then and have been forgotten. So just bringing Japan into the picture is very important. And there's another thing that really helps us when we bring Japan in, because we realize by looking at the Japanese case that the direction of transnational flows of knowledge and institutions and ideas, it's not necessarily in one direction from the West to the so-called periphery. And once you include Japan, you realize that in many cases, Japan was not only a taker of ideas, but often a maker of transnational knowledge, imparting what it had learned and what it had developed to other countries. And, you know, if we think about this, it's obviously in the case of modern East Asia and Southeast Asia, Japanese models have been very important, really from the Meiji period on, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But at certain points in history, Japanese models have been important for the Western world as well, as I'll show you in a few minutes. So I'm convinced that scholars of Japan can actually make valuable contributions to global or transnational history if we start thinking more transnationally about our own case, our case of Japan. And what I think we should do as scholars of Japan is we should exploit our so-called comparative advantage. In other words, we already know the difficult case and the difficult language, Japanese, and it's relatively easy for those of us who have started with Japanese, who know Japanese archives, to use one of our European languages. If it's an American, it's probably English, but I know some French. I'm learning German. But you know, for you Israelis, you probably know all sorts of European languages. And so it actually gives the scholar of Japan a real advantage because, I mean, put quite simply, it's much easier for us, starting with Japan, to learn a little bit about Britain or France or Germany or Italy than it is for any of the scholars of the West to suddenly master Japan, whether Japanese or Japanese archives. So we do really have a comparative advantage. And a second thing, so that's talking about how we scholars of Japan can contribute to transnational history in general. But I also think in a second way that transnational history actually will improve the study of Japan. It can contribute to Japanese studies itself. One of the main things that will contribute is so much of what we encounter in the study of Japan reeks of exceptionalism. You know, we do it ourselves. Many of our Japanese informants tell us this and that is uniquely, distinctly Japanese. And, you know, we have Nihonjinron, you know, these sort of national character studies. By bringing some transnational perspective to the study of Japan, we begin to realize that many of the things that supposedly seem uniquely Japanese were actually formed as part of encounters with the rest of the world. And so it's very important to keep that in mind. Well, enough of abstractions. I've talked in generalities. But what I want to do in the rest of the talk is I want to give you some very concrete examples of how, in my own work, I've used transnational history. And most of the examples will come from the recent book that Shalmit introduced you to, which, if you haven't seen it passed around, there it is. And I brought the cover not simply because of shameless self-promotion. There's actually an intellectually valid point here. You will notice that Japan does not appear in the title. So it's beyond our means why America spends while the world saves. But despite the title you see now, this book has evolved over a long period of time. And originally, I intended to write a book exclusively about Japan. And it was going to be exclusively about the last 130 years or so, how the Japanese government had been very interventionist in many ways, and I've talked about this in a previous book, but in the case of molding economic habits, that the Japanese state had been very aggressive, both through institutions and big moral suasion campaigns, in terms of molding a culture of saving in Japan. So that was going to be the book, And when I started thinking about this, I just assumed that the Japanese state, by so heavily intervening to form economic habits of people, that this was maybe not uniquely Japanese, but it was quite distinctive, quite abnormal compared to Western countries. I thought maybe it was partly East Asian or maybe uniquely Japanese. But the more I read the documents, documents from the Meiji period and Taisho and the Showa periods, and read the Japanese documents, it became very clear. Almost every document was about what institution they had learned about in the West, which they then established in Japan. And it became clear that one couldn't talk about this topic in isolation. And then as I went on, I realized it was even more interesting than that I might actually be able to say something meaningful about the rest of the world. Because what we notice is that Japan is not at all exceptional in terms of emulating or imitating or learning from what they saw in the Western world at the time, the Meiji period on, but that all of the countries that emerged as great powers and modern nations were similarly engaged in transnational learning, and that one could actually in this case I focused on saving, I'm not talking about saving so much today, but simply using that as a device, I realized how interconnected everything was and how ideas and institutions were very freely flowing around the world, and that Japan picked up on this. Moreover, when one thinks about this, Japan, even though we talk about Westernization in very simple and uncritical terms, Japan emerges as a modern nation state in the late 19th and early 20th centuries at a very distinctive moment in the development of Western nations. That Western nations weren't always like Western nations, but that the 19th century was a period of intense nation building, intense mobilization of peoples, and that this is the world the Japanese saw. And in many ways, the Japanese incorporated what they saw. Obviously, they had developments in the Tokugawa period that helped reinforce these things, but the Western learning, the learning from the international order at the time, was indispensable. So what did Japanese see when they looked at the Western world in the Meiji period in the early 20th centuries? Well, first, they saw that from about 1800, that European nations had been very active in trying to create an idea of modern citizens who enhanced the power of the state, made society more orderly. In my own case, in my own book, the Japanese would have seen things called savings banks, which was a huge social movement in the 19th century. It's not just a bank, it really is a social reform movement. These things were founded from about 1800 on, all over Europe, and stretching across to North America, also to Australia and New Zealand. The idea of a savings bank was exactly the idea of trying to create a modern subject, a modern citizen, somebody who was orderly, somebody who planned for the future, somebody who had a stake in the country. These were all the words that reformers used in the early 19th century when they founded these banks. And also, quite curiously, there is an interesting gender component in what the Japanese saw in the 19th century world. They began to see, particularly the British, but also on the continent as well, the idea that women might actually be useful to the nation state and to the community. You start to see this gender division of labor, where women, particularly middle-class women, if we're talking about Victorian Britain, begin to be seen as the housewives, the homemakers, the people who keep account books and things like that. And those of you who know something about Japan can probably see where I'm going. Believe it or not, in the Tokugawa period, there weren't Japanese housewives the way they are today. They weren't people who kept household accounts and managed the children exclusively. This was something that evolved in Japan, and clearly inspirations from the West. Again, I'm not saying it's total imitation, but this encounter, this dialogue with gender developments, this is a new thing in Europe as well. The idea in the mid-19th century of women as possibly the people who save. Or the people who keep. So you can see down below, the man says it was my industry, in other words, my hard work, but her saving. Something that many Japanese households would be very comfortable with today. So this is one of the things the Japanese saw. They also saw this new institution called postal savings. It was started in Britain in 1861, the Post Office Savings Bank. Like the savings bank, it was seen as a great social experiment at the time because it was a way of bringing saving and habits of saving and diligence and thrift to the masses in a way that went way beyond savings banks because it involved the government in allowing people to save at these highly accessible post offices. Most Americans, they know about postal savings in Japan because it's a big problem and maybe it's being privatized, maybe it's not being privatized. They know that and they assume that, oh, postal savings is another one of these unique treasures of Japan. Maybe not such a treasure, but that it's something unique. Well, I mean, you live in Israel, you go to Europe, you know better than that. Americans, they don't live in Israel and they certainly don't go to Europe. If they do, they don't see anything. But if they did, they looked up, they'd see their postal savings banks everywhere in Europe. And of course, they do start in 1861. And the Japanese become one of the first nations of the world, because it's right after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. In 1875, Japanese officials very quickly adopt postal saving. And you could say the rest is history. I mean, it is now the world's largest bank, not just the world's largest postal savings bank. And just to show you, again, what a transnational phenomenon it was, by about 1900, nations were actually showing off postal savings as being a sign that they were socially progressive. And if you go to Central Europe, you'll see a really funny competition between the two parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the old one. In Vienna, they commissioned the best architect of the time, a guy named Otto Wagner, if you've been to Vienna. And he puts up this really wonderful postal savings building, if you've ever seen it. It's still there, you can tour it. And in Budapest, I didn't bring the image, but the Hungarians, not to be outdone, erected the Royal Hungarian Postal Savings Bank, and it's very fanciful. It combines Art Nouveau and Folkish. It has little beehives and bees crawling up. It's really, really wonderful building. But again, it shows you that the Japanese were not very unique in really shopping in this marketplace of ideas. Now, something else the Japanese would have seen, the world of the late 19th century was the world of mass education, of compulsory education systems. They were just really coming online at the time. And this is something else the Japanese would have seen. I mean, I saw when I came in that this building, which is called the, what's it called? Yeah, so apparently they're from Belgium? Belgium? Yes. Well, I didn't know that, but of course, the most important country in Europe to the Japanese was Belgium. I mean, maybe not entirely, but a lot of Meiji officials took Belgium very seriously because Belgium was involved in some of the great social experiments of the time in the late 19th century. And the Japanese officials, in many cases, they identified with Belgium. Now, if you compare the size of Belgium and Japan, there doesn't seem to be much of a comparison. But what was Belgium? Well, it was this, tiny country with almost no resources that only because of the diligence and thrift of its people had pulled itself up to be, a major investor and even a colonial empire. Well, one thing Japanese officials talk a lot about is they talk about the system of school savings in Belgium, because the Belgians were actually on a national basis the great innovators in introducing the idea of molding the habits of young children and making them the diligent and thrifty citizens of the future. So this is a wonderful Belgian image from about 1900, 1906. This rather self-righteous girl with the pigtail is telling all these children these are the consumers. There are a few Belgian consumers. There's 3 of them here.
Chocolates.
Yes, they've come out of the confiserie, the candy store, and she's saying, no, 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 you want to go to the Caisse d'Épargne, to the National Savings Bank, which was basically equivalent to the Postal Savings Bank of Belgium. And you can see the Japanese quickly adopted school savings programs by the 1890s. By the early 1900s, Japanese had some of the highest rates of school savings. So again, this idea of mobilization. Now, the Japanese obviously had a temperament where they kind of liked the management of society, but in terms of the concrete institutions, they are very much formed by what the Japanese see. And this is a very nice poster from the 1930s, but you could have seen something like this as early as 1900. And again, if the Japanese looked around at the Western world, they wouldn't see the world of American individualists. They would see people lining up, okay? And you know, here you can see in Australia, they're lining up. This is a school savings bank. You bring in your coins every Monday all over the world, you know, from Munich to Manchester to Melbourne and even to my home, Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Even there, I mean, I did show this image, sorry. I showed this image of Minnesotans lined up, you know, ranked by height. And I showed it in Heidelberg a few months ago. And my German hosts were incredulous, and they said, well, how did you get Americans to line up in such an orderly way? Yeah. And I said, that's easy. You know, they're all Swedes and Germans, because that is where I come from. And there were a few Jews, but yeah. But again, this is what the Japanese saw. So all this stuff about Japanese regimentation and discipline and all that, well, maybe the Japanese were somewhat more extreme than others, but not by much. I mean, this is what the world looked like. Well, what else would the Japanese have seen? Oh, I think I missed one image. Sorry. They would have seen character building. One of the big things from Japanese, the Meiji period on, is, of course, a much emphasis on you know, constructing you know, the morality of Japanese children and of character building. But as many of you know, this was hardly uniquely Japanese. And from middle-class reformers in Japan to state officials, a lot of emphasis on character building, but character building in relation to nation building. Now, was this uniquely Japanese, thinking that you mold a character to make them a strong subject? Again, not really, because one of the most popular, perhaps the most popular writer in Japan in the 1870s was an Englishman. He wasn't an Englishman, sorry, he was a Scot, named Samuel Smiles. He is the famous author of the book Self-Help in 1859. He's less well known to those of us in America, but still quite well known around the world for writing another book called Thrift in the 1875. And as some of you know, Samuel Smiles was very, very popular in early Meiji Japan. And in fact, Self-Help became one of the very first books in Japanese moral or ethical education, the famous Shushin courses. So it's interesting, you're molding Japanese subjects, but you're using a Victorian British text. There were actually several illustrations here commissioned by the Ministry of Education, maybe sometime around 1890, maybe a little earlier. But they're illustrations for Japanese school children of various stories from Samuel Smiles' Self-Help. So that's the world the Japanese saw. Now, let us move on to, when we get into the 20th century, it's quite interesting. So far, the Japanese in the Meiji period mainly engage in being the taker of transnational knowledge, emulating, imitating, if you will. But the period of the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 5, ushers in a new era where Japan actually becomes a player, an actor, in this global marketplace of ideas and institutions. And I think many of you know this story, but the Japanese defeat the Russians in 1905. It's a big surprise. And in the process, a lot of Western journalists and also Western nurses and others went to Japan. They covered the Japanese side. I mean, this was really one of the first wars that was really covered on a global basis by journalists. And particularly the British, and to some extent the Americans, brought back glowing reports of Japanese success, you know, trying to understand why the Japanese had done this. They had achieved victory. And the British in particular were very impressed by the Japanese victory. Of course, Britain and Japan had just become allies in 1902 in the Anglo-Japanese alliance, but several British journalists began writing these very glowing stories and talked about how Japan was not only militarily successful, but they had won the war because they had managed to mobilize the home front. They had managed to convince, as they said at the time, every man, woman, and child of Japan to engage in sacrifices and to contribute to the Japanese war effort. So you started to get books, particularly in Britain, because Britain felt a real sense of decline by 1904 and 5, felt a sense of decline with Germany coming up and Britain seemed less economically successful. And so this was kind of the first learn from Japan craze in Britain, and it was called national efficiency. That nation, the British in particular, had to learn how to be more efficient again. They had to be organized, and they too had to learn how to organize every man, woman, and child to, in one way or another, either work for the nation or work for social efficiency. And so you had this very influential book by a journalist in Japan, a man named Alfred Stead, called Great Japan, of course a play on the words Great Britain, a study in national efficiency. And you had other books. This was a professor who'd been in Japan a long time, but Dai Nippon, the Britain of the East. The idea that what was happening in Japan was not necessarily unique, but something that the British could actually learn from. And this is when you had the interesting cult of Bushido. But it wasn't just normal Bushido. It was Bushido that the British could actually import and use to revive the martial spirit and to revive the national efficiency of Britain. Now, Bushido itself is a really interesting transnational phenomenon. I think some of you know this. I mean, Bushido had, of course, existed in the Tokugawa period, but it literally meant the way of the samurai. And since samurai were maybe only 5% of the country, that the code of the samurai in the Tokugawa period was literally the code of the samurai. But in 1899, a Japanese man named Nitobe Inazo wrote the book Bushido, but he wrote it in English. He wrote it for a Western audience because he was trying to explain to, actually a Belgian, believe it or not, a Belgian friend. Belgium is really, it's so important and everybody forgets it, but anyway. He was trying to explain to this Belgian jurist, you know, what was the substitute for Christianity in Japan? And he said, I thought and I thought about it. And I thought that was revealing. He really did have to think and think about it. And he said, oh, you know, it's Bushido. And, you know, and then his Bushido flows through the veins of every Japanese. Well, I mean, that's an absurdity. Bushido did not flow through the veins of ordinary Japanese. It flowed through the veins of samurai, and that's it. But he communicated this in English. It took years to translate it actually back into Japanese, and then the Japanese said, oh, yeah, we got Bushido. But anyway, so it was in English. It was for an Anglo-American audience. And then, you know, so these British reporters, they get to Japan. And it's kind of like CNN reporters who don't speak any language, you know. You know, and they got like 2 books to read on Japan. And one of them's Bushido. And they said, oh, yeah, the Japanese are doing well. It's because they got Bushido. And, of course, the backstory is Nitobe is a Quaker. So, you know, yeah, he's a Quaker. So, you know, his Bushido, his Bushi never killed anybody in Bushido. But all of a sudden, Bushido becomes this explanation of how the Japanese were, you know, this like mean and lean, you know, war machine and all that sort of thing. And then, you know, then it sort of spun into like medieval warrior cults in Britain. And so it was something that a lot of British gentlemen said, well, you know, it's kind of like, you know, chivalry, what we had, and we've lost it in Britain, and Bushido can kind of help us revive this. This is our cult of national efficiency. And we get to H.G. Wells, who was a big national efficiency man. And in 1905, in the midst of the Russo-Japanese War, he publishes his book, A Modern Utopia. It's another one of these utopia things. But the guardians of H.G. Wells' utopia were called the samurai. The Order of the Samurai is what it says here. And you see a very interesting kind of ratty-looking depiction of the British samurai, you could say. But his samurai were honest, they were austere, they were frugal, they were self-disciplined. They actually went to samurai clubs once a week and engaged in conversation. In other words, they were British Victorian gentlemen. But the idea was, so this transferability of, but it was quite a stimulus. And it gets actually more serious than this, because When we get to World War I, just about 10 years later, and the British are at war, and they're engaging in a war of the type the world had never seen, a total war, a war that goes on for 4 years. Very difficult to finance it, very difficult to produce for it. The British begin to reorganize their society for war, and in many ways even go further than the Germans, whom they're fighting, in a very efficient, very top-down system of national mobilization, including the mobilization of saving, but other things. And interestingly enough, a lot of the people involved in the British World War I mobilization were the big proponents of national efficiency and the cult of Japan 10 years before. And they too used the words that in World War I, the British must mobilize all men, women, and children. Exactly that formulation they picked up from Japan. And so they organized, I mean, just because we're talking a little bit about saving, they organized this the British organized this very efficient system of the mobilization of saving called the National Savings Movement. It's orchestrated by central officials. They set up national federation and local savings associations, and it looks kind of Japanese. Because it's this kind of idea of top down from the ministry all the way down to the village level, organizing people into neighborhood associations and things like that. And so the British, in a sense, they've learned from Japan in World War I, and then right after World War I, Japan in the 1920s begins to learn back again from Britain, and looking at a lot of British wartime mobilization, and particularly in savings, begin to organize modern British-style savings campaigns. And here's what these things would have looked like. So when the Japanese and others would have looked at the big belligerents fighting World War I, they would have seen, you know, the new world of propaganda, the use of posters, of radios, of cinema, of advertisements, you know, things that really hadn't really existed in the 19th century. You know, these very, very big moral suasion campaigns. They also, the reason I put up these two posters is they're basically the same poster to show you that one is, I know they're hard to see over there. The one on the left is Joan of Arc Save France, Women of Britain Save Your Country. And the one on the right says Joan of Arc Save France, Women of America Save Your Country. And clearly it's not an accident. The two were learning from each other, but the Japanese were also learning from them. Because of course the big message again is the importance of women to the nation state at war. Women as being, because in total war so many men are removed from the locale and the household, that women become really the guardians of the home front, the saver citizens, but engaging in war production and all sorts of things like that. And to show you how the gender construction really spins back to Japan, you can see, you have the same iconography. By the way, and this is not an accident. You know, one of the things about being transnational historians, you don't just show coincidences, you actually show links. The Japanese government, from 1917 to 1920, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was gathering Western posters and Western propaganda because envisioning the next total war and that Japan could learn from what the belligerents were doing in World War I. So they looked at posters like this American poster with the woman on the home front buying, you fight or buy bonds. The men fight, they're in the foreground here. The woman is the saver. And then you get almost an identical poster. And there were many posters like this that the Japanese saw. An identical poster in peacetime in the 1920s, but it will also be a major motif in Japan during World War I and in the post-war period. And believe it or not, there weren't a lot of Japanese housewives in 1900, you know, who took their husband's salary and, you know, distributed it back to them. That's something that did not exist. And this was a new gender formulation in the 20th century. And in many cases, it was formed by the encounters with the West, where they saw that sort of gender construction. And lots of modern women and women's groups and women's magazines really sponsored this formulation. Well, we moved to World War II, which is a new topic of mine, as Shalmit mentioned, to look at home fronts, both Japan, Germany, but also Britain. And that's too very transnational, because by the time of World War II, all the belligerents have learned lessons from World War I, and they've also learned lessons from each other. So if you look at wartime Britain, liberal democratic state, but it incorporates all the mechanisms of total war. It organizes its neighborhoods. In this case, organizes its neighborhoods for civil defense against bombardment, because everybody knows they're going to face bombardment of cities in World War II. So you have British air wardens and British neighborhood associations, and of course you have in Japan, Tonarigumi, Chonai Kai, that similar sort of organization. It's because this is something that they're all learning from each other. It's actively being formed. And you get this, very interesting parallelism. In total war, your workers are very important. Male workers in particular, very scarce in heavy industry because of mobilization. And they earn a lot of money because their labor is scarce and in demand. So it doesn't matter whether you're in the Soviet Union or fascist Italy or democratic Britain or authoritarian Japan, you all have that image of the bare-chested worker who's very important. You've got to appeal to that person. You want that person not to spend all their wages, but to put their wages all back into national savings to finance the war effort. And women as well. The mobilization of women in World War II, you're not only trying to get women to save, but you're getting women to manage other women and other households. You're using them on the home front as the leaders of local women's associations and savings associations. And in this case, you see in the Japanese poster, it's really in the middle of the war with China in the late 30s, you see this would be the local leader of a Fujinkai, a women's association, and her job is to knock on the doors of the households in her village or urban neighborhood and demand or implore them to contribute more and more of their national savings to the war effort. I mean, in other words, to put it into savings, but of course it directly finances war. And you'd say, well, okay, well, the Japanese very interventionist in everyday life, but you can see in Britain as well the same sort of mechanisms. They're all being formed globally, transnationally. This is right from after the war, but it could have been during the war. The woman in green is playing exactly the same role. She is called the savings worker, and it is her job to be just as intrusive as the Japanese woman and to knock on doors. In this British poster, this household seems very happy to see her. In fact, they would have hated her because she's the neighborhood busybody. She's intervening. She's saying, I know you've got some more income. You've got to buy national savings certificates. So you have these very, very similar mechanisms. Well, we get to the post-World War II period, and this is a period when the war doesn't seem to stop. I mean, it stops, of course, but the mobilization of the home front continues after the war. There are all sorts of campaigns in Japan after the war, state-orchestrated campaigns, in particular to get people to save money and economize for the recovery of Japan. It's called the Kyukoku Chochiku Undo. Kyukoku, a very strong word, means national salvation. And when I first started studying this, I thought, wow, the Japanese are really distinctive. The war has stopped, but they're continuing to mobilize their people. And then I started reading the Japanese documents, and they said, look at the rest of the world. Everybody except for the Americans has basically been defeated. I mean, even the British, they supposedly won the war, but their cities are destroyed, and they're deeply in debt. And this is what the Japanese would have seen, and this is what they did talk about in the documents. They said, look at Italy here, look at France, look at the Eastern Europe. Everybody is engaged in these austerity and savings movements to finance the reconstruction of their countries. And they particularly, the Japanese documents, singled out, again, British movements for national savings after World War II, when the slogan in Britain was to keep on saving, that the war is just about over. You can see this very racist poster here. Germany's already been defeated. The Japanese are yet to be defeated, but that's going to come. But even after that, you have to keep on saving for reconstruction. You see the blueprint behind the Japanese soldier? It's got things like education, housing, health. In other words, the post-war British welfare state. So you have to finance that. This is what the Japanese saw. And I suppose I should say in passing, I'm almost finishing up here. Am I okay on time?
You're okay.
Okay. This Keep On Saving poster, you see with the burning cross? I was going to use that as the cover of my book, the book you just saw. But my publisher said, if you have a burning cross, no American's going to buy the book. And all my Christian friends said it made me feel really, really uncomfortable. And all the Jews loved it. But there weren't enough of them. So I took it off. And I used this nice Norman Rockwell warm American illustration, and everybody just felt so much better, even though America's really in trouble. But okay, so, but anyway, in the 1950s, you can see there's an interesting parallelism between Japan and the European countries, that in Japan you're supposed to save, so you can save to finance production, so you can send more trips to this more trucks of goods to this place called Gaikoku, which looks like California. So in other words, you're saving to promote exports, but you can see in the British case on the left here, export and thrive, the same idea that and all the British documents say Britain is a small island country with no resources. You know, where have we heard that before? So again, this is the world the Japanese were in. So the Japanese, again, were not behaving so uniquely. And then the idea that as the economies recover in Europe and in Japan, there's a new notion in the 50s that you don't just have to save and economize, you can consume, but you need a balance, a balansu. And so you have this Japanese poster on the left, but it turns out to have been copied from the British poster on the right. The war, this period of post-war austerity, it ends in both Japan and Europe by the late 1950s. But interestingly enough, Japan becomes another transnational, a new type of transnational actor from about the 60s and 70s and 80s. It becomes very important to the rest of Asia. It becomes really the poster child, you could say, for a type of economic development. The Japanese miracle is being touted by development economists. And of course, saving, domestic saving and mobilization is very important. So you see that the Japanese model gets actively transmitted to much of the successful economic parts of the rest of Asia, starting with South Korea, which is understandable because, of course, South Korea had been a Japanese colony and it had inherited in many ways many mechanisms of Japanese governance and a promotion of saving. But also there's active Japanese assistance of the Bank of Korea from the late 1960s after normalization between Japan and South Korea. And so you get these Japanese-style savings and frugality campaigns in Korea. Now, I don't know how many Koreans are in the room. I don't want to say that the Japanese totally invented this. Well, I could say it here. I'm not going to say it in Seoul, but but it's kind of true. But anyway, but there's active learning, and I have all the documents. I actually got in trouble with the Bank of Korea on this. I had to pull this cover too from another book because the Bank of Korea got upset because I said there was a Japanese influence. But anyway, but enough about me. Anyway, so it's transmitted to Korea. China in the 1980s, after Deng Xiaoping or with Deng Xiaoping, I should say, post Mao, of course, set up lots of banks, huge banks, to mobilize capital, to mobilize saving. One of the things they set up, they re-established postal savings. It had been shut down under Mao, and Japanese assistance. Actually, teams from China came over to Japan. They studied Japanese postal savings. Japanese postal savings system's actually been quite active in supporting the Chinese postal savings system, at least about 30 and 20 years ago. And interesting, in Malaysia, as late as about 2001, they explicitly sent teams of people to Japan to learn about how to set up a Malaysian savings campaign. And this was actually a PowerPoint given to me by the Central Bank of Malaysia. Well, I'm going to close by showing you some of the complexity about transnational learning. and how it can really change how we understand things. And to end with this image, Japanese model, also pretty important in Singapore, which has both a compulsory and a voluntary savings system. This is what you could call a typical image of Singapore from the 1970s, or could be from the 1990s. It's of children lining up. And if you ask the former Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, he would say, this shows us the impact of Confucianism, or maybe Asian values, unlike the degenerate and undisciplined West. You know, Singapore children know how to be disciplined, they know how to be diligent and thrifty, but let me remind you that you put these images together, the Australians and the Singaporeans, and you say, well, maybe it's a little more complicated where all this comes from. Gee, what is Australia and Singapore? Oh, they're both British colonies, weren't they? So there's a British national savings model, but we also know in the case of Singapore that Japanese influences have been very powerful, starting actually with the Japanese occupation of Singapore during World War II, but from the 1950s on, Japan as this very persuasive model to Singaporean leaders. So I end with this image to show you that how you can, if you just shut the rest of the world out when we study Japan or any one single country, and we just do a national history, we assume a lot of things that really aren't true, that the world is much more complicated and much more interconnected. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sheldon, for a very thought-provoking and interesting talk. And now I would like to open the floor for questions. I'm sure we all have many questions.
So I just stand up here? Okay.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay.
Alex,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Please introduce yourself.
No, it's okay. I think you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm fine. I don't know. But speak loudly because you have the rest of the room here.
Alexander Buch, University of Tsukuba. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. But I'm a bit confused about usage of terms transnational history as opposed to international history.
Yes.
To the best of my knowledge, transnational history emerged from the kind of critical historiography, maybe starting with Benedict Anderson, in an attempt to go beyond the nation.
Right.
And as opposed to international history, which very much deals with international exchanges, flows of ideas from one nation to another.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there have been attempts, and you probably know, in Japan to kind of write transnational history of East Asia, especially because of the historical problems that they're facing.
Yeah.
And from the literature that I've read, they failed, because at the end of the day, they run up into the national border, the national politics, the policies of their nations. But listening to your talk, I think that basically your field, which to me sounds like economic history, in a way, I think probably this.
Thank you, I guess.
It seems to me like probably one of the best areas to actually engage in transnational history, go beyond the nation, to look at the various institutions.
Yeah.
But listening to your talk, I was a bit confused, because it seems to me that you go both ways. I mean, you do transnational history in terms of history of institutions, or maybe history of ideas.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you do look at like various influences within the confines, between one nation to another.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, how do you see this difference between transnational history and international history, and which way you try to go?
Well, first of all, I don't think about it much.
Okay.
No, but deliberate. I know exactly what your question means, but I don't think about it deliberately, because why should I trap myself? I want to explain things, and I want to show the complexity of the world. So I don't particularly care what school of thought I fall within, but you do bring up an important point. There is an ambiguity about the term transnational history. I would never describe myself as an international historian, because that sounds too much like high power relations, and that's not what I'm doing. These are very mundane relations often, but okay, the ambiguity in transnational history is it could be simply transcending the nation, and it could be, you know, immigration is always a great case. The flows of people, you know, I mean, if you're in, you know, Manchuria in 1910s, you know, what are you? You know, so it's that ambiguity of borders. Borders aren't so important, things like that. So the movement of peoples, that's very important, and that's certainly a very legitimate part of transnational history. But the other meaning of transnational history is you don't actually have to throw out the nation state to do transnational history. If you have, let's say we have our Quaker friend, Nitobe, and when he goes to Philadelphia and he marries his Philadelphia wife, he's not representing the Japanese state. He's a guy moving across borders, and yet he will come back to Japan and he will impart his knowledge, and middle-class reformers will pick it up, and you can say, well, they're not members of the nation state, but they do have a relationship to the nation state. Officials will pick him up. He'll become a principal of a national high school. He'll become a foremost colonial thinker. So why try and differentiate and say, well, I'm going to be a transnational historian. I'm just going to study people who never will have power. Why not be flexible and say, I want to look at the flow of people, ideas, institutions in their entirety and see what I learn from that. And that I might actually learn that in many cases it reinforces the nation state. The nation state may be the active learner in it, or they may learn from the people who are actually flowing across borders. So that, I don't know if that satisfies you, but it's not just international history, because it's not just the relations between nations. I just want to see anything that flows, basically, because I think it's really important. Yeah. Do you want people to come up and ask their questions so everyone can hear?
Professor Garon, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. However, I have one question.
If it's too short, then. Yeah.
Oh.
Sorry. Professor Garon, thank you very much for your talk today and the interesting ideas you shared with us. However, I have one question which regards the idea that there is a plethora of ideas and concepts running around the world, and people do exchange. This is something which is very, I think, natural and it's being there. But the main question should be, as far as I can tell from your talk, why would, say, a Japanese saving model follow a Belgian one and not a French one or a Chinese or whatever, you know?
Right.
Certain point in history brings different options and different possibilities. Why was a specific one chosen as the model to follow rather than another one? And, you know, it repeats here in the Singaporean or whatever.
Right.
And so how far do you go with this question of why was this model followed and not another one?
Right. Okay. Very, very good question. I mean, it's this whole question of the process of emulation. And, you know, if you think back a couple of generations ago in Japanese studies, there was a lot of emphasis put on something called selective borrowing, and that the Japanese, particularly in the Meiji period, were said to be very clever because they picked the German model of the general staff because the Prussians had just beat the French, and they picked originally an American model of local education, but then they picked a French model, and so the whole thing was said to be very systematic. In fact, there's never one model out there. And that's why I try and think in terms of this kind of global marketplace of ideas. So a lot of stuff is swirling around. So in the case of Belgium, for example, I didn't want to leave you with the idea that all of Japan can be explained by Belgium. Although, if you look at the Bank of Japan, it's actually modeled after the National Bank of Belgium, but there we are again. But the point is that when the Japanese looked for inspirations, one of the things they heard in Europe is the Belgians are really being innovative. So that made them curious about it. So it's partly not because the Japanese are so clever, but that they're actually good at listening to what others already engaged in this transnational process are talking about. So I would never want to reduce it to they cleverly chose one model. That's a circulation of ideas, and they're looking at a lot of ideas. And that some become more dominant at some times and not at others. But so it's not necessarily a systematic process. It's not a predetermined process. It's a lot of mixes. It's really a flow of things. I mean, I don't know if that satisfies you, but you think about when you're trying to do something and you look around for ideas. You don't just latch on one thing. You know, you look at several possibilities. You probably end up blending a lot of them. But that's how I see it. Is that okay? Okay.
Hi, Hideki Hara from the Japan Foundation based in Tokyo. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. And my sort of question is kind of twofold. One is when you actually say that the idea of flow or Japan learned something out of Britain or other countries, who are the actual agents of those information or ideas?
Right.
Were they just government officials themselves, or academics, or? And the other question is that when the idea flows, and there's a high chance of misunderstanding and distortion, and as in the case of the recent phenomenon, like Japan used to be very crazy about the Finland education, Finnish education, and there's something called the Finnish.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Finland method.
Yeah.
But I asked everybody in Finland, and nobody knew about the Finland method.
Well, I'm surprised. I mean, it's actually well understood in Europe.
Yes.
The Finnish
and that's that kind of tells how how distorted, how misunderstood sometimes, and those ideas, which is theoretically very good.
Yeah.
When it actually comes across the national borders.
Right.
So if you have comments on that,
Yeah.
I'd be happy to hear.
Yeah, you actually asked two good questions. One about the agents in the transmission, then one about how things are actually accepted and implemented. The agents, there's really a variety of agents. I mean, Japan is relatively easy to study in this respect because it is far away from a lot of these models, and it's very expensive to get to the United States and to Europe. So in the early stages, a lot of the learning is actually mediated by state officials because they're the ones who can provide the money. But not exclusively state officials. And as I said, Japanese Christians, that's a major area of transmission. People who work in social policy and social work, often who are non-state actors, but they still have some relationship with state institutions. Again, a lot of Christian social workers, various academics, as you say, and now as an academic in Japan, is that person a state official or not? Well, most of them actually were state officials, right, if they were at imperial universities. But so one has to be flexible, but there are a lot of different actors, and then there are a lot of different actors from the Western side, too. A lot of reformers also going around the world and lecturing on things. So the agents, it's a diffuse group of agents, and there are women agents too. I mean, because as we get into the 20th century, a lot of women's activists in Japan are very interested in reform movements and also the idea of housewives in Anglo-American society, and they're familiar with and they've traveled or they have Western informants. But as to the acceptance, the implementation, that is a really interesting part of this process. And I don't want to communicate to you that these things are taken and accepted totally, or the way that they started out. The adaptation is very interesting. Now, we always say the Japanese are unique in adapting things, but everybody turns out to adapt things. I mean, that's part of the process. But I do want to argue against the idea that the Japanese Japanize everything so amazingly that it bears no resemblance to the institutions in the West. That's not true. That these institutions are actually and ideas are very important. They are transformative, but of course they're mediated and they're adapted, and they are everywhere.
Looking at a current situation, I'm not from the academic world.
Yeah, but we still need to hear you.
Okay. My name is Michael, and I'm not from the academic world, but I have a question about something that's more recent in Japanese history, and I wonder whether you looked at this as a transnational kind of institution, let's call it. The way the Japanese are dealing with disaster relief in the wake of what happened there. Would you say that they are a source of information for others transnationally to benefit from, or are they benefiting from the knowledge of other countries in the way that they dealt with this issue?
That's a good question. I mean, they're doing both. And that's the important thing here. They are a taker and a maker. I mean, clearly, after the Kobe earthquake, Japanese government was quite severely criticized for a lack of effective response, and there was a lot of study by people in the Japanese government who deal with disaster relief on what to do about it next, and they clearly studied a lot of different models, and they clearly learned things. But it's also true, and this has a long history, that because Japan is a country very prone to serious earthquakes and tsunami, of course they invent the word, that really since the late 19th century, other nations, including Western nations, have actively learned from the Japanese in terms of seismography, on construction. I mean, even in the 1890s, there was a big earthquake in Japan, and it was noticed that the Japanese structures, the wooden structures, actually survived better than the Western structures that were more rigid. So that actually spun back, and Western nations learned a lot about earthquake response in that respect. So one has to see this in both ways, because there are a lot of things right now that experts in the West are learning from the Japanese, just as the Japanese are learning from places all over the world. It's never one or the other, I think. Yeah, Yuri.
Yes, thank you for the most brilliant presentation, but just allow me, as a historian of much earlier periods, to be advocatus diaboli of national history. It works perfectly for the period which you depicted your understanding,
right.
But surely for post-Meiji Japan, naturally they want to engage with the world, to learn from the world, and in the early 20th century, Chinese sending students to Japan, learning about the world, from Japanese bad translations of Western books, mistranslating them back into Chinese, and then making this huge mess in China. But 50 years before, in the mid-19th century, no single Chinese will think about it, or not a single, a very minor segment of elite members will think about learning from any country in the world. So something happens. What will be your case should you go back 50 years from Meiji back? How much transnational history will you create? Will it not be then a minor aspect of great national history, national culture?
You mean going back in Japanese history?
In Japanese history, yes.
Right. Well, it is true that, I mean, one of the things about transnational history, so there's some confusion, transnational history, global history. Certainly transnational history is, as I say, I would think a subcategory of global history. And of course, to have transnational history, to some extent, you have to have a nation. Well, you do. I mean, you have to transcend something. Okay, and so, but the question is, but you picked Japan, and I can't say as much about China, except that some might say that was a mistake on the part of China, not being more transnationally aware. But the Japanese seem to have an interesting base for their investigation of Western nations, even going back into the Tokugawa period. And I'm not a specialist, but I've read fairly widely. And there's more and more study of science in the Tokugawa period, and a lot of it, I mean, of course, there's this famous Dutch studies coming through the Dutch, but there's a lot of development within Japan based on what they have learned from the Dutch and what they innovate and do serious science with, particularly natural science and other things like that. There's also an active translation project that starts, Ben-Ami, let's see, I mean, 1850s, but it starts actually before that, doesn't it, in the 1820s to some extent? Yeah, and that's quite interesting, because certainly the group that's actually engaged in the 1850s and early 1860s working for the shogunate and some of the domains, they go on to be some of the prime investigators in the new Meiji government. So that's very important, you know, and of course, maybe it begs the question, why do the Japanese seem to be quite good at this, you know, whereas the Chinese not as good? And you know, that's a serious question. I don't have a wonderful answer to it, but one of the answers is they're not China. Okay, in other words, that they're not the central kingdom, and they see themselves quite self-consciously on the periphery, and they see that there's, you know, even though Tokugawa Japan's quite Neo-Confucian, they, you know, by a certain point, it's seen as a Chinese learning, but there's Indian learning, and there's Dutch learning, and there's a sense that they do see the world in maybe more of its complexity at an earlier stage. Nonetheless, it is remarkable how fast and how systematic they become these transnational learners. So.
Please, Professor Sheldon.
As it's a conference about Israel and Japan.
Yeah, sorry.
Let me return to what our dean said about one of the similarities between Japan and Israel, which is the curiosity.
Yeah.
Now, in Japan, as you said, there's nothing unique, but there's something, you know, special, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's the curiosity. The Japanese have shown since the beginning, since the first contact with China, a huge curiosity about what is happening outside of Japan. Mm-hmm. They were much interested, although they were never conquered by China, they were very much interested in what's happening in China. Now the Chinese were not interested in what's happening in Japan. So you find that this sort of thing is not equal in any country. Some societies are have more curiosity about what's happening outside the country. And I think the Jews have the same thing, always curious about everything. Okay. As our dean said.
I didn't think of that. Okay.
So,
transnational learners.
For instance, if you take the Tokugawa period, Japan was closed in the Tokugawa period, you know, military closed, political closed. But the Japanese were so curious about Europe that they knew about Europe much more, let's say, than the Arabs of North Africa that were geographically close to Europe but didn't care about Europe. Now, the Chinese at that time were not interested at all, as we have here in Japanese history. And that continued until the late 19th century when they saw Japan succeeded and started being interested. And even later then, for instance, during World War II, the Japanese wanted to establish this big civilization under their control, and many intellectuals were sent to China. And when they came back, they reported, and they said one of the strange things that they found in China, that they said when you enter a bookshop in Japan, it's full of translations from Chinese philosophy, history, art, literature. When you enter a bookshop in China, there's hardly anything of translation from Japanese. The Chinese are totally not interested, neither in Japanese ancient history, not in modern history, only in those things that can help them, you know, in modern times. So, would you say that some societies show more curiosity and some societies show less curiosity about other societies, and what can the reason be?
Wow. So I am in Israel, after all. Okay. Well, I don't know if I want to comment on that, but I mean, obviously, I mean, I don't know if I agree with you on everything. I'm sure there are transnational learners in China, and there were, you know, certainly from the late 19th century. So maybe not as much, maybe not as systematic. but I will say that, you know, the Japanese are very, very good at this, but it is interesting when you go to the countries of Europe, you know, particularly, well, even now, because of proximity, and before 1945, because of constant war, countries in Europe really did study each other. Now, they didn't care about Japan. Okay, fine. So in that sense, the Japanese are learning more from Europe than the Europeans are learning from Japan, except for a few cases. But the Europeans are very willing to learn from each other. And to some extent, you know, they're studying American capitalism and you know, industrial efficiency from the Americans. So there's a lot of transatlantic learning going on. So you would find the equivalents to Japanese in lots of European countries who are really looking at each other. And in my book that I just wrote, I mean, you can see French studying Belgians and British studying Germans, and you can see a lot of learning going on across Europe. And certainly militarily, they're studying each other because it's vital. But there's, you know, in the two world wars, they're studying their home fronts. So you would find the same sort of systematic listing and analysis of models inside Europe as well. And so we have the explanation of Europe and maybe the explanation of Japan. They both behave, all these countries behave as nervous great powers that are not sure how long they're going to remain great powers, and they have to keep innovating and they have to keep learning. And maybe people in other countries, partly nation states, not necessarily as well organized in other places, not in the great power arena, and maybe there's less pressure to do this sort of learning.
Professor,
I do enjoy very much the lecture in both senses, contents and the style. You dispensed very eloquently with the word uniqueness, and you avoid mentioning the word culture. And I think maybe I had that in mind when she asked you the question. You haven't mentioned it on purpose? Or?
Yes. Oh, I knew I forgot something. No, you know, it was on purpose. Okay, why? Because I'm certainly not arguing that culture is unimportant. Obviously, culture is very important, but culture is not static. It's not unchanging. And cultures change, and they get shaped, and they get reshaped. And, I mean, I like to say on the saving thing, you know, every country I go to, you know, the Germans say, well, we save because it's in our national character. And the Japanese say, we save because it's in our national character. And the Koreans, of course, say it's really our unique national character. But the whole point is that 200 years ago, nobody saved in a bank. So this was something people had to learn. And in a sense, this is what culture is about. People learn things. Obviously, they build on certain cultural formations. But I can tell you, Japanese, Germans, everybody, they're a lot different 200 years later than they were in 1800. A lot of things happen, interact, a lot of things flow back and forth. And so these help form cultures, and at any given moment there are distinct cultures. I mean, I come from a country with a very distinct culture, but it got formed too. Some people say the American culture will never change. I hope that's not true. But the whole point is that if we start our analysis by starting with culture, then we have defined away all the interesting questions in history. And then we just say, oh, the Japanese did it because it was the Japanese way and they're like Japanese. Or the Germans do the German way because they're Germans. It provides no information. It provides no analysis or explanation. So I'm willing to end with culture, but I don't want to start with culture.
Oh, well, so many interesting things and so many more interesting questions to ask. But I'm afraid we are already in time to finish this session. We have coffee in the lounge, no?
Cocktail downstairs.
Cocktail downstairs, okay, cocktail downstairs. And then there is the opening ceremony at 6. So you are all very welcome, and thank you very much. Thank you very much.